Hi, welcome. I am trying to learn medieval studies today, early parliaments in Britain. After we've done it, we're gonna do extensor carpi on our strength training. And if you participate in the extensor carpi on our strength training, then it's gonna be early parliaments. The first steps in the forming of parliament occurred in the 13th century. The long, slow process of evolution began with the Curia Regis, the king's feudal council to which he summoned his tenants-in-chief, the great barons and the great prelates. Okay, somewhere in the 13th century, there was the Curia Regis, and that was the king's feudal council, and where the king invited and summoned the tenants, the great barons and the great prelates. I don't know what prelates are. And where the people came together. Okay, the king invited all people into a convention. This was to a meeting. This was the nucleus from which Parliament and, more specifically, the House of Lords developed. Okay, and from that the tenants, barons and prelates were invited to talk about a subject that is more or less the beginning of Parliament or the Houses of Lords. The House of Commons originated in the 13th century in the occasional assembly of representatives of other social classes of the state, knights and burgesses, usually to report the consent of the counties and towns to taxes imposed by the king. Okay, that sounds almost like there was a second meeting. So one meeting for the tenants, the barons and prelates, and the second meeting were just the knights and the burgesses. I don't know what they are, the rulers of the castle. Some people knights and some people who had an area to govern were coming, but just to say that they are fine with the taxes imposed by the king. Its meeting were often held in conjunction with a meeting of a great council. Its meetings with a great council for the early 13th century recognized no constitutional difference between the two bodies. Okay, so at the same occasion, at the same event, two groups were invited. One big group to talk with the king and another group to consent with the king. The forming of Parliament as a distinct organ of government took at least another century to complete. During the Barons' War, Simon de Montfort summoned the representatives of the counties, towns and lesser clergy in an attempt to gain support from the middle classes. So there was some type of Barons' War, and there was Simon de Montfort, some person, and he wanted to have some people on his side. So he invited the leader of the counties, towns and clergy to him. He wanted the support of the middle classes. His famous parliament in 1265 included 2 representative burgesses from each borough and 4 knights from each shire. Okay, there was a borough and he summoned in 2 burgesses and 4 knights from each shire. 2 burgesses from a borough and 4 knights from a shire. This was the first time that all classes, with the exception of serfs, were represented in Parliament. Serfs, I read it somewhere, that is not so high as peasant, but not so low as slave. So somewhere in the middle, I think. So everyone was representative of their classes, a part of the serfs, who I guess were the major part of the population. Before a century had passed, Parliament had the right to make laws and levy taxation, and the knights and borough representatives had begun to sit as a separate body with commons. Okay, not much explanation in detail, just before a century had passed. There happened now that the Parliament had, for some reason, maybe through some power plays, maybe through war, I don't know it, had gotten the right to make some laws and levy taxation. And there was a separate meeting, a part of the Curia Regis, and where the knights and borough representatives were there called the commons. The division of Parliament into 2 houses did not come about until the 14th century. The lawful position of Parliament was at first not very different from that of the Great Council. Okay, we don't know really what the lawful position of a parliament was, or of a great council. In the 14th century, parliament began to gain greater control over grants of revenue to the king. I don't really know what grants of revenue are. Money paid to the king, I guess. And they had a part of control over that. Why specifically on that subject? Why should they specifically have a power to say what money goes to the king? That seems to be like one of the last things they would have a say in. Whatever, I don't really know what that even means, the grants of revenue. Statute legislation arose as the petition form was gradually replaced by the drafting of bills sent to the king and ultimately carried out by commons, lords and kings and king together. Okay, they made some type of statute legislation, but then they more did drafting of bills, which were sent to the king and were carried out by commons, lord and king together. Now here, for that it would be helpful to know the difference between statutes and bills, and I don't know it. Whatever, there happened some change of what they had to rule or to govern. They were no longer making some statutes, whatever they are, they were more making bills, which were then given over to the king, lords and commons to carry them out. Impeachment of a king's ministers, another means for securing control over administrative policy, also derived from Parliament's judicial authority and was first used late in the 14th century. Okay, in the 14th century, the Parliament had judicial authority and could impeach ministers of the king. In the 15th century, Parliament wielded wide administrative and legislative powers. Okay, even more power in the 15th century. That could make administrative, so they can rule what happens where in the country a bit, and also legislative. They could be a part of making new laws. In addition, a strong self-consciousness of a part of its members led to claims of parliamentary privilege, notable freedom from arrest and freedom of debate. Okay, I don't really understand the first part of the sentence, but they got then the right not to be arrested and that they could debate however they wanted, whatever that means. With the growth of a stronger monarchy under the Yorkists, so the House of York dominate, that would be in the 15th century. So with the growth of the Yorkists, and especially under the Tudors, and in the 16th century, Parliament became essentially an instrument of a monarch's will. Okay, they are saying here now that it had even more power, probably in the 13th, 14th, 15th century, than in the 15th, 16th century. And there it became, in the 15th, 16th century, more or less instrumented or ruled by the king, and not so much independent. The Barons' War. There we have something to the Barons' War mentioned here by Simon de Montfort, who then summoned in some people to get the support of the middle class. The Barons' War, 1263-1267, so 4 years in the 13th century. The Barons' War was between King Henry III and his barons. That's what the name Baron means. The Barons' War. I thought it was a name, so it are the barons, the nobility, the ring, or whatever it is. The Barons' War was between King Henry III and his barons, and in 1261, Henry III renounced the provisions of Oxford, 1258, and the provisions of Westminster, 1259, which had vested considerable power in a council of barons, and reasserted his right to appoint councillors. I don't know what renounced means. Maybe I looked it even up once. I get now from the context he took it back. There was the announced provision to make Oxford and Westminster Abbey, which he now took back. And he also took again the right to make councillors. So Henry III did 3 changes which the barons didn't like. The barons, led by Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester, finally resorted to arms in 1263 and forced the king to reaffirm his adherence to the provisions. Okay, the barons were not happy that Oxford and Westminster were no longer getting the provisions. I don't even know what it means, provisions. And that the king could not make the right to make new councillors. And there was the leader of the barons, Simon de Montfort, who assembled an army and fought against the king, or forced him then with the power of his army, whether he used it or not, to go back to his provisions to Oxford and Westminster. In 1264, a decision in favor of the crown by Louis IX of France as arbitrator led to a renewal of war. Now, we looked up arbiter in etymology. In that context, that would be a person where both parties have agreed on that that person is deciding in a matter. That would make sense from the context, but that would mean that Simon de Montfort and Henry III had decided that the French king should say which of the two parties should have a will. Let's take it all with a grain of salt. Okay, that was Louis IX, and he said something, and that led to the renewal of war. Montfort defeated Henry's forces in the Battle of Loos, and the king once again submitted to government by council. Okay, the barons, led by Simon de Montfort, won against the king. Early in 1265, Montfort summoned his famous representative parliament to strengthen his position. Montfort got his parliament together out of a... That makes sense. His army had won against the king's army. So, if he summoned now 2 burgesses from each borough and 4 knights from each shire, they might even appear. This was threatened by the possibility of an invasion by Henry's supporters abroad. That he wasn't doing the summit. Okay, Louis IX had previously decisioned in a way that the war was renewed, which was firstly taking place because there was inagreeability with what the king was doing. That means it makes sense that King Louis IX of France was more or less tending to be on the side of Henry III, the English king, than on the side of the barons. And for whatever reason, we won't know what is happening there. There was a threat of an invasion, probably by King Louis IX of France. The invasion did not take place, but an uprising against Montfort of the Belgian marshals led to his defeat by the king's son later Edward I at Epsom. Let's read it again. The invasion did not take place, so France did not invade. But an uprising against Simon de Montfort of the Belgian marshals led to his defeat by the king's son, Edward I at Epsom. Okay. Simon de Montfort was the leader of the barons, revolting more or less or disagreeing with the king. He had won previously against the king, but when Simon de Montfort, wherever he was ruling, had problems with an uprising in Wales by the Welsh marshals, whatever they are, by the Welsh. And this trouble there led him that he lost against Edward I, the son of King Henry III, at Epsom. Montfort was killed in the battle, but some baronial resistance continued until 1267. Okay, lost the battle against Edward I, the son of Henry III, and he even died in the battle. The barons had failed to establish their own control over the crown, but they had helped prepare the way for the constitutional developments of the reign of Edward I. Okay, they were not having so much control, but they had a part in the development that there was a constitutional reign of the successor against which they fought. So that there was some control over what he was fighting. We have Edward I in the next part. The present Houses of Parliament are situated beside the River Thames. They were built between 1840 and 1860 and incorporate part of the medieval Palace of Westminster. There's the Parliament in Britain. Now, if you were here for medieval studies, you can go directly to the next part where we'll continue with medical studies. With Edward I, I think. If you stay here and participate in the extensor kappa in our strength training, then it's better down. Hands up, strong fists, down and up. Down and up. Hands like that, down and up. Now we can take a sock, press onto it, down, up, middle, outside. Don't do anything if it causes pain. Middle, upper hand press, down, up, middle, in, out. Middle just press neutral, and just snooter. And those were hands. But it was for short, and we don't have time of short and extensor cover. Now strength training. I thank you very much, and until next time.